Then how about an isolated system? And we already said that an isolated system, my example is the perfect thermos flask. So I had to draw an image that illustrates what we have as a thermos flask. And many of you must have seen a thermos flask before. You can just look up Google and type example or image of a thermos flask. You see what I'm talking about. So, but this is like the internal structure of a thermos flask that allow it to operate as an isolated system. So in a thermos flask, all right, so what we have here are the key concepts in thermodynamics, and we're going to be going through them very quickly. So there are things that you need to know. When you know them, it will help to aid your understanding of thermodynamics. So the first thing we want to discuss in these key concepts is the system and surroundings. So in thermodynamics, you hear system, you hear surroundings, and you need to know what systems are and what surroundings are. So what's a system? A system refers to the part of the universe that is under study. So in thermodynamics, the word system refers to the part of the universe, that place that thing you are focusing on that is currently under study. Then what about surroundings? Surroundings refers to everything outside the system. So if my focus is on this, every other thing that is outside that thing I'm focused on is referred to as the surrounding in the context of that system. So what about boundary? What is boundary? Boundary refers to the interface between the system and the surroundings. So the interface between the system and the surrounding. And interestingly, the interface that we have between the system and the surrounding, it can be a solid interface, it can be a liquid interface, and it can also be a gaseous interface. So the interface between the system and the surrounding can be solid, it can be liquid, it can be gas. So but that interface is what we refer to as a boundary. So for the purpose of illustration, we'll look at an example. An example is a cup of tea in a room. So using a cup of tea in a room, we're going to illustrate what a system is, what a surrounding is, and what's a boundary. So before we look at the cup of tea, let us just look at a typical, illustrating image. So we have this as our focus, the part that we're looking at, what we are studying. That part we are studying is what we refer to as a system. So but then every other thing that is outside that system is what we refer to as the surrounding. Then the boundary refers to the interface between the system and the surrounding. So this is the boundary, this is the system, and this is the surrounding. So that's basically. So let's now look at a cup of tea as a typical example. So a cup of tea inside a room. Now the cup is just right there seated. So the cup of tea is our system. So our system is this cup of tea. So but then this cup of tea, outside the cup of tea, which is the room, basically is what we refer to as the surrounding. So the surrounding of the cup of tea is the room. I hope that's making sense to you. Then what is the interface? The interface refers to this, what is holding the whatever the cup is made up of. So if it is a ceramic cup, then that ceramic is what that clay you have there is the boundary between the cup of tea and the room. So you have the cup of tea as the system, you have the room as the surrounding, and then you have whatever material it's made of, whether it's ceramic, whether it is metal, whether it's plastic, as the boundary. So that is how what we refer to as the system and the surroundings. So let's now go over to another key concept which refers to the types of systems. So the types of systems. So types of systems, we have three types of systems in thermodynamics. So the first type of system we have is what we refer to as the open system. It's what we refer to as the open system. So what's an open system? What's the next one is a closed system. We're going to talk about that. And then the third one is an isolated system. So we have open system, closed system, and isolated system. So let us look at what an open system represents, what a closed system is, and what an isolated system is. So an open system is a system that can exchange both matter and energy with the surrounding. An open system can exchange both matter and energy with the surrounding. And you know matter can be solid, liquid, gas. I don't know if that makes sense to you. And then energy with the surrounding. An example of an open system is a boiling pot without a lid. A boiling pot that has no lid. So just as an example, so you have You have the tripod, and then we have the fire, then we have the pot that's on it, and then the pot's boiling. So because it's boiling, you have vaporization occurring, but there's no lid. So a boiling pot without a lid is an example of an open system. So he said that you can exchange both matter and energy. So what does that mean? Now, the application of the heat that you're having from this place is transmitting energy. And what's the energy that is being transmitted? Heat energy. So the boiling pot is receiving, energy from the fire that is external. So there's exchange of energy. And then the boiling pot, because of the boiling process, there's vaporization. And that vaporization is causing the liquid content to change into gas, and that gas is going into the surrounding. Now that gas is an example of matter. So what's happening is that there's an exchange of energy in the form of heat, and there's also exchange of matter from liquid to gas that is going out of the surrounding. The moment you place a lid over the pot, automatically what you're going to have is a closed system. The reason is because a closed system is a system where there can be exchange of energy but not matter. An example is a sealed flask. So when you have it sealed, automatically you can no longer have gases go out, but energy is still being transmitted. Energy is still being exchanged from the fire to the pot itself. So, and vice versa, as the case may be. So that is energy being transferred, but matter is not being exchanged with the surrounding. So remember that when we are talking about the exchange is happening between the system and the surrounding across the boundary. So the surrounding here, you have the fire, and then the fire is transmitting energy via the through the boundary into the system, but the system is not transmitting matter out. So whatever is outside is not entering inside the pot, but what is inside the pot is also not going out because of the presence of this lid. So this is a closed system, because even if energy can be exchanged, matter cannot be exchanged. So that's what we have as a closed system. Then what's about an isolated system? An isolated system is more interesting because an isolated system, there is no exchange of energy or matter. That means energy is not exchanged, matter is not exchanged. And that is a very, very typical example of an isolated system is a perfect thermos flask. A perfect thermos flask is such that any stuff you put inside the flask, it maintains that temperature for an extended period of time because it is not exchanging matter and it is not exchanging energy. So let us now look at illustrations that will help us to understand open system, closed system, and then isolated system. So this is an example of an open system. The reason is because there is heat transfer. There is heat transfer. So if you put your hand over this cup, for example, you have the heat from the key. This is an example of a teacup. The heat from the teacup is going into the surrounding. So that is heat being transferred. The boundary of the cup, if you touch the cup, you also feel the heat because the heat is also being transmitted from the body of the cup into the surrounding. So there's heat transfer, there's energy transfer, there's energy exchange basically. So but then mass transfer, which is the exchange of matter, these are just similar stuff. So matter, mass transfer, which is the exchange of matter, is also occurring because the movement of the gases from the teacup into the surrounding is movement of matter from the system into the surrounding. So there's exchange of energy and there's exchange of mass in the system. So that is that for an open system. So this is an open system. Then the next system we now have is a closed system. And in a closed system, there is exchange of energy, because even if you close the lid you have on this teacup, the surrounding of the teacup is also emitting energy, and you can feel it when you touch the cup. In fact, if you place this cup inside a small volume of just regular water, that water is going to get warm. The reason why the water will get warm is because although there is no transfer of mass, there's no exchange of matter, there is exchange of heat, because the heat from inside the system via the boundary is already being spread into the surroundings. So in a closed system, in a closed system, you have exchange of energy. Most times it's usually in the form of heat. Most times the change of energy is usually in the form of heat, but there is no exchange of matter. There's no mass transfer. there's no exchange of matter. So that's the difference between an open system and a closed system. Then how about an isolated system? And we already said that an isolated system, my example is the perfect thermos flask. So I had to draw an image that illustrates what we have as a thermos flask. And many of you must have seen a thermos flask before. You can just look up Google and type example or image of a thermos flask. You see what I'm talking about. So, but this is like the internal structure of a thermos flask that allow it to operate as an isolated system. So in a thermos flask, you basically we have this is where the main content of whatever you have is going to be put in. So you can have your liquid, for example. So you can have the liquid substance inside this place. Let's assume what you want to store inside the thermos flask is a hot fluid. So you put the hot fluid. The moment you put the hot fluid inside the thermos flask, you place the cork and the cork covers it. Now, this hot fluid in this thermos flask, let's assume that you don't have all this other structure outside. This hot fluid in this thermos flask with the cork is going to make it a closed system. So because the cork automatically will not allow the exchange of matter, but then this part of the flask is capable of allowing the exchange of heat. It will be a closed system. So then I had to add an insulating layer to also ensure that there's no exchange of energy. That is what makes it an isolated system. So what you now have is that you now have another layer that is outside the layer where you have the content of the flask. And then in between the boundary of the content of the flask and the extra layer that is added, you have a vacuum. So you can see that you have a vacuum. So this is a glass wall. This is a glass wall. It can also be metallic too. It can be metallic, it can be glass, but in this case, we are using a thermos flask that has a glass wall internally, a glass wall in the middle also, and then in between the two glass walls, you have a vacuum. Are you following me now? So we have a vacuum, and then that is not enough to not allow like transfer of energy. They now have to put silver linings. So they put silver lining on the glass, and then they put silver lining on this other surface. Now, what's the idea of the silver lining? The idea of the silver lining is to reflect back the energy into the flask. So when energy wants to go out of the flask, when it hits on the silver lining reflects it back into the flask so that it cannot be able to exit the flask. The energy in the flask is not going to exit the flask. And the one that is coming from outside too, the silver lining here will ensure that no energy coming from outside is going to enter into the flask. So when energy comes and hits on this silver surface, the silver surface reflects it out. So energy is not coming from inside to the system, and the energy inside the system is not going out by the presence of vacuum and by the presence of the silver surface you are having there. And just to show that it is not still enough, there's also a casing. So there's a casing. So what we have here is the external casing you now have. All of these processes is to ensure that there's no matter. No matter is transferred because of the presence of the core, but no energy is transferred because you have a vacuum, you have a silver surface, and then you now have a case to ensure that whatever is inside remains inside and whatever is outside remains outside. So this is a perfect thermos flask illustration where there's no exchange of energy, no heat transfer, and there's no exchange of matter, no mass transfer. So that's basically that about a type of system. So let's now look at the properties of a system like we have talked about previously. So we have what we refer to as extensive properties, and we have what we refer to as intensive properties. So extensive properties are properties that depend on the amount of substance. Extensive properties of a system refers to the properties that depend on the amount of the substance. So mass depends on the amount of a substance. So mass depends on the amount of a substance. And then volume depends on the amount of the substance. So the more the substance you have, the more the volume, the more the mass. And then energy also depends on the amount of the substance. Then when we now come over to intensive properties are such that are independent. They are independent of the amount of the substance. So they don't have anything to do with the amount of the substance. So an example of intensive property is pressure. Whether the amount is small or not, you still have the pressure being featured. You have temperature, you have density. So those are the difference between extensive properties and intensive properties. Remember when we talked about the definition of thermodynamics, we talked about the fact that it's a relationship, or it tries to show a relationship between heat, work, and energy. So I'm going to go ahead now to explain the differences or the relationship between heat, work, and energy, and then we can now make progress from there to explain what differentials are in the context of thermodynamics.